Okay, now we're live. And we're gonna wait for attendees to join us. Takes a few minutes for people to filter in. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everybody, regardless of where you are dialing or interneting in from, hopefully not dialing. I'm just super excited for today. This is our 5th of 7 in our amazingly successful, really exciting Psychedelic Science 2020 webinar series, something that we've been planning well before this pandemic started. And just super happy to be able to provide this information and these points of connection to psychedelic therapy and psychedelic research to the whole world. So thanks everybody for joining us. We have over 2,000 registrations for this webinar series. Of course, everybody who's registered is going to get a recording to this after, so we're not going to have all 2,000 of those probably joining us today, but who knows? It may very well be the case because we have two very exciting guests joining us today. It's very rare to get both Rick Doblin and Amy Emerson on the same schedule, in the same place, at the same time, because they're both so busy working on so many things. I'm going to give a quick technical introduction. I'm Brad Burge, Director of Strategic Communications for MAPS. I'm going to be in the back end handling the Q&A portion. So during the talk, or you can start right now if you want, you can put your questions down in the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen. If you type your questions into the chat box, we are not going to see that. So please get those questions into the Q&A box. You can also see the questions that other attendees have put in and you can upvote them. And at the very end, we're going to leave about half an hour for Q&A. So we'll pull as many of those popular questions as we can and get Rick and Amy to answer them. Couple technical things. If you're having any technical problems, you can log out, close your Zoom, and come back in using the same link. That solves most problems. Close other programs, that helps a lot. If you have any questions about the webinar or any feedback, we super welcome that. Email us at webinars@maps.org. And again, this is going to be recorded. This is being recorded now. And if you can't catch the whole thing, we will be emailing a link to this, including the presentation, to all registered attendees afterwards. So I'm going to turn off my screen, but I will be here answering questions and forwarding those on to Bia. I'm excited to hand this off to Dr. Bia Labate, who's been an amazing host and moderator. So happy to be working with you, Bia, to get us going. Thank you so much, Bia.
Hi, Brad. Hi, everybody. So good to be back online to, we don't see you, but we feel you. And so my name is Bia Labate, and I have a PhD in social anthropology, and I'm public education and cultural specialist in MAPS. And so we do a little generic intro to the webinar session, and that's a little bit just an overview of why we think this is important. So we want to bring academic and scientific knowledge to a larger public in more accessible ways. We also want to give people a chance to interact with researchers and clinicians and learn about the backstages of their work and the dilemmas they have, the challenges they face, the day-to-day of their advancement of their studies. And we also want to do the other way around and give the researchers and the people doing the work on this field a chance to hear the community, the anxieties, the doubts, the curiosities, what is on people's minds. So it's a chance to tell them. Of course, we can't take all the questions, but we do our effort. And we just also want to inspire this new generation of millennials or people from other fields or people that maybe have a little bit of prejudice about psychedelics or feel worried to dedicate their lives into this research path. We want to show you that this is a good career opportunity and that we are in another time and there's many research to be done. So we hope to inspire people. And today we have from our own clan. So it's kind of especially nice for us because it's our turn to show what we're doing here in MAPS. We have the title of the session is Towards Legal Psychedelic Psychotherapy. And in a nutshell, we have two foundational big figures for us that you probably all know. You can also read their bios on our site, maps.org, right on top, webinars. Follow this design on Brad's screen. You can find all the info there. What is this session about? This session is about MAPS strategy. What do we mean by strategy? Strategy is why. Why did MAPS wants to bring psychedelics into the mainstream? Why MDMA and not others? And why PTSD and not other conditions? So do you know? We can hear from the man that has this vision originally, and from all the rest of the team. Also, this dilemma, the substance and the therapy, what is more important? Both? One is more than other? We're going to learn about that. And then just the multiple different studies that have been going on different fronts with the MAPS work with the VA, direct connections with the VA. We're going to have an overview of that. And then just, the coming more to the more contemporary heated debates that have animated, passionate conversations in our field: legalization, decriminalization, medicalization. Are they conflictive? If we take one path, are we jeopardizing the other? Some people feel strongly that decriminalization or deprioritization should be a priority. Others feel that that's too little, we should go for legalization. Others feels that medicalization is actually better and more steady, more solid. And where is MAPS leadership on that? And how are we tackling all these issues? And then what's next for MAPS? What's the more important, urgent things that are happening in our field? Did you know that we're just about to complete the first of 2 phase 3 clinical studies? That's huge. MAPS has been doing work for decades. So that's my intro. So happy, Rick and Amy, that you're here. And the ball is with you. Thank you.
Well, okay. Thank you, Bia. And welcome to everybody who's here. It's just so exciting to have you all join us in this webinar. And I'm going to briefly talk about our strategy and give you a bit of history of why we're doing what we're doing. It's going to be brief because if not, Bia's going to cut me off. So I've been warned ahead of time. All right, so now let me see about sharing my screen and see if this works. Let's just see. Oh no, did it not work? Let's just see, PowerPoint.
Rick, we can see your screen. We just need you to click slideshow play.
Yeah, now I don't know if this, okay. Is this it? I think, oh, here we go. I think I know now. Use slideshow. Is that it? Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Towards legal psychedelic psychotherapy. So just to be very clear, you probably all know this, but this is our corporate structure. MAPS is the nonprofit, and I started in 1986, so 34 years ago. And in December 2014, we created the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation, and that's the for-profit pharmaceutical drug development arm. And that's the group that will sell MDMA by prescription once we get approval from FDA and regulatory agencies around the world, and then the profits will be reinvested in the mission of MAPS, which means further research and educational efforts. So the for-profit is 100% owned by the nonprofit. This is possible because of something that good old Ronald Reagan did when he was president in 1984. He signed a bill that was designed to create incentives for the development of drugs that were off patent. So, you know, MDMA was invented in 1912 by Merck. It's in the public domain. In the late 80s, early 90s, when I saw all these Ibogaine people suing each other for intellectual property, I went to their patent attorney and I said, develop an anti-patent strategy so nobody could patent any of the uses of MDMA, which we've done. So nobody can patent, including us, MDMA for PTSD or any of the known potential uses of it. But what this law does is it gives whoever gets the data to the FDA first to make a drug into a medicine that's off patent, nobody can use that data. You would have exclusive right of that data for 5 years. And the FDA is requiring us to do studies in adolescents with trauma if we succeed in adults. And this data exclusivity provides incentives for that. You get an extra 6 months data exclusivity, and it blocks anybody from applying to market a generic until the 5.5 years is over, and it takes the FDA at least 6 months or more to review all their documents. So basically there's this 6-year period where we may be the only ones to be marketing MDMA for PTSD. Now, other groups, if they wanted to, could generate their own data, but it'll take them 5 or 6 or 7 years, well over $100 million. So chances are we don't think it'll happen. And in Europe, it's 10 years. So that's why December 2014, we created the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation, because selling MDMA for profit is not something we can keep inside the nonprofit. We have to pay taxes on it, and we're not going to be price gouging like all the concerns people have about big pharma. Now, since its founding, MAPS has raised over $80 million in donations for our therapy, medical marijuana research, and education, all of our Zendo harm reduction, everything that we do. We've raised over $80 million. Now, not all of this has gone into making MDMA into a medicine, but a good portion of it has. So again, about strategy. So of all the psychedelic drugs and of all the clinical conditions, why are we focused on MDMA? Why are we focused on PTSD? And a couple of the things that sort of formed this decision have actually gotten even stronger, the reasons for. So first off, the reason why MDMA. MDMA is the most gentle of all the psychedelics. Some people even say it's not a psychedelic, it's an empathogen or entactogen. It's easier to integrate the experience. One of the other main reasons is that we believe that therapists who are going to use this drug with their patients will be more effective if they have tried MDMA themselves. I think the same is true for LSD, for psilocybin, for ayahuasca, all of that. But I think the resistance among psychotherapists and psychiatrists for themselves taking psychedelics, it's greater for the classic psychedelics than for MDMA. So by focusing on MDMA, we also ease the path into training more psychiatrists and psychotherapists. So that's basically the reasons for why MDMA. Now, why PTSD? So this is a picture of from 1984. This is me and Marcela Otalora, who is now one of our lead trainers of therapists and runs phase 2 and phase 3 studies out of Boulder with her husband, Bruce. But at this time, she had PTSD. And so she was the first person that I ever worked with as when I was learning to be a therapist, and it was very helpful to her. And I kept seeing her get better and better and better as time went by, and not going to become a quote MDMA abuser or anything like that. So I saw the power of MDMA assisted psychotherapy for PTSD, and I knew that that's one of the great uses of it. So that was 1984. When the DEA criminalized MDMA starting in 85, I started MAPS in 86, and already I had manufactured through Dave Nichols a supply of a 1.5 kilos about of very pure MDMA, and we'd also done 28-day toxicity studies in the dog and in the rat, which was sufficient to get us into phase 1 and phase 2 studies. So it was already clear to me at this time that MDMA was going to be the drug, but the clinical condition wasn't so clear. And there was getting more and more concerns about neurotoxicity. And so even though it didn't seem to be a problem, the theory was that, according to NIDA, National Institute on Drug Abuse funded researchers, that this would be a time bomb. Even though we don't see problems now, when people age, they're going to show problems. And so we felt that the only way to go forward then was with cancer patients who were not going to live a long time, and that they had anxiety about their cancer diagnosis, anxiety about death, and that we could do a study with MDMA for cancer patients with anxiety, and we would sort of sidestep the whole neurotoxicity issue. And at this meeting in 1992 with FDA, that's where the FDA decided to open the door to psychedelic research. And that was a formal advisory committee meeting, and it was about our MDMA cancer patient protocol. But what FDA said was that they would approve research and they would regulate it the same way they regulate research from big pharma. And that meant that even though there was a lot of history of MDMA use by this point from the middle 70s, at this point, millions and millions and millions of people have used it. We knew a lot about it, but the FDA said you have to start with a phase 1 dose response safety study. So Charlie and I shifted gears and said, yes, we'll start wherever we can. So we did that, and that was mostly through the 90s. And near the end of the 90s, though, Charlie, we started going back to do the cancer patient project. But he got a little bit concerned that the rave movement was really growing, the controversy over neurotoxicity was growing. Hefter Research, the other nonprofit big one, started in 93, right after this 1992 meeting. And so Charlie decided to switch to psilocybin for cancer patients. So that's how the whole situation developed with psilocybin for cancer patients. Charlie was the one that started that, which was actually a really good thing, because that got me in a position then to wonder, well, okay, if I was working with Charlie on cancer patients, maybe we can do something else. What are we going to do? And then I met Michael Mithoefer. This is later. This isn't right when I met him, but I met him in 2000 at an ayahuasca conference, the first conference ever on ayahuasca by Ralph Metzner, who organized it in San Francisco. And Michael approached me and he said he wanted to set up an offshore clinic where we could bring people and give them psychedelic therapy. And I said I was absolutely not interested in that. Let's go to the heart of the system, change from the inside out. Let's go to the FDA. And Michael said that he was an expert in PTSD. I said, perfect. So we decided then to embark on MDMA research for PTSD. And the reasons are, we need a patient population that is highly sympathetic to the American public, and lots of people suffer from it, and the traditional treatments that are available don't work for everybody. So PTSD, roughly 6 to 10% of all people will develop PTSD in their life. Roughly 18% of Iraq War veterans have PTSD, and PTSD in civilians much higher. In conflict zones, refugees, almost all of them have that. And only 40 to 60% of patients respond adequately. But the other big part of this, again, is that our culture really highly values veterans. And in some way, there's something sad about this, that the most people who have PTSD are women from childhood sexual abuse, from domestic violence, from adult rape and assault. But they don't get quite as much attention, even though there's a lot of sympathy for them. So it's even more so sympathy, though, for veterans. And that's where I think PTSD was an ideal thing for us to focus on. September 2018, there's over 1 million veterans receiving disability payments from PTSD from the VA. So this is an enormous problem. Just to give you a sense, in 2004, there was only 215,000 veterans receiving disability payments for PTSD. So this is mostly the Iraq and Afghanistan war has produced this explosion, this growth of of veterans with PTSD. And the VA now spends roughly $15 to $20 billion per year in disability payments for PTSD. So it's an enormous amount. In 2017, $7 billion were spent on drugs for PTSD, mostly SSRIs, which Zoloft and Paxil approved for PTSD. So it's an enormous problem with sympathetic patients, and MDMA is actually ideal for it. So I learned this later, this neuroscience part I didn't learn when we made this choice, MDMA for PTSD. But what this shows is PTSD changes your brain, increases activity in the amygdala, the fear processing part of your brain, decreases activity in the prefrontal cortex, where you think logically, and reduces activity in the hippocampus, where we process memories into long-term storage. And MDMA changes your brain also, but in the opposite way. It decreases activity in the amygdala, so you don't react so fearfully to fear-based emotions or to fearful situations. You have an increase in activity in the prefrontal cortex, so you can be a little bit more logical about what's happening then, what's happening now. And it increases the connection between the hippocampus and the amygdala, which is super important because that helps take these memories that in PTSD are never quite processed, never quite away. It's always like about to happen or happening, helps people process it into long-term storage. There's also a recent study in octopuses that shows that they're mostly solitary unless the very infrequent mating periods, and even then they're hardly spend any time with each other, no cuddling. And then when you give them MDMA, though, they become prosocial. So there's something super deep in our evolutionary history. We separated from octopuses 550 million years ago. but MDMA makes octopuses more prosocial as well as humans. And then also the same researchers from Hopkins did really important work with mice that they published in Nature, the most important scientific journal, and they showed that MDMA releases oxytocin, the hormone of connection, nursing mothers, love, and that it opens this social reward learning period, and which means people are more social, more open to bonding, and also that this oxytocin release catalyzes a growth of new neurons, new neural connections, really, so that you're actually rewiring your brain when you're taking MDMA, similar, but not quite in the identical same ways with psilocybin. So all of these things then came later, but this reinforced the idea that MDMA is really ideal for PTSD. And because of the veterans, we've been able to get funding from a wide range of people across the political spectrum. The Mercer family has pledged $1 million a year over 4 years for research with PTSD. The only restriction was that it be in veterans. They were the main funders of Trump and Bannon, and Cambridge Analytica they owned, and Breitbart as well. Elizabeth Cook's father is Charles Cook, but she's apolitical. And she is very interested in trauma and has pledged $900,000 a year for 3 years for our the GMP MDMA process. We've also, this is again Richard Rockefeller, who spoke here about healing PTSD and multi-generational trauma, but Richard's family, the Rockefellers, have donated around $2 million as well. And then we go to George Soros, who also funded a project that we had for training therapists of color. So we've been able to have really bipartisan support in our funding base. And I think a large part of that was due to MDMA for PTSD, that choice. We do point out that it's not the drug, it's the therapy. This is a therapy intervention facilitated by MDMA. And we have a training program for therapists that have multiple parts in it, an online portion, a week-long in person. We're struggling to figure out how much of that we can turn virtual. We had this optional period where people can volunteer to take MDMA as a patient to see how the therapy is delivered to them. That's one of the most valuable ways of training people. And we also then have role play, all videotaped and reviewed by our training team. And then the final part is people, new therapy teams work with one PTSD patient under supervision of our therapy team. So that's it. We will end up giving diplomas of some sort, and we think that we want to make the taking the MDMA optional. We want to welcome skeptics. We don't want to force anybody to take a drug, but we think patients should know if their therapists have done the drug or not. And so here's the diploma for those people that have taken the MDMA. As part of our strategy also, we're trying to reach out to therapists that are connected to the VA that have developed non-drug psychotherapies for PTSD, see that it doesn't work for everybody, and are willing to do research blending MDMA with their therapies, which we will pay for. And so through Richard Rockefeller and his cousin, Senator Jay Rockefeller, who's on the Senate Veterans Affairs Committees, we've got, after a lot of effort, we got approval from the National Center for PTSD to work with researchers affiliated with them, but they had to use their academic affiliations. We had to pay for it, and the subjects had to come from outside VA. But the first study was blending MDMA with cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy. Conjoint means couples, or dyads, where one has PTSD and it affects the relationship, and both were part of the therapy. And in our merge thing, both of them get MDMA. So this was a way for us to back into couples therapy, but also a way to really move from 2 therapists for 1 person to 2 therapists for 2 person, one-on-one. And this was tremendously successful, and Candace Monson is now the president of the International Society of Traumatic Stress Studies, the most important group of people involved in PTSD research. Her protege, Ann Wagner, is about to start, once we can start up again, cognitive processing therapy, blending with MDMA for PTSD. The Barbara Rothbaum at Emory and connected to the Atlanta VA is going to do a study with MDMA assisted psychotherapy combined with prolonged exposure, which is the dominant form of therapy for PTSD. Thousands of therapists chained in this throughout the VA. Elsewhere, in Edna Foa, who developed prolonged exposure, the queen of PTSD research, who at one point said she would MDMA was dynamite in the brain, has now said she's interested in working with us to do a study that will take place in Israel, combining MDMA with prolonged exposure. We're potentially about to cross a effort of 30 years trying to start research inside the VA, and we're working with Rachel Yehuda, who is at the Bronx VA and at Mount Sinai. And what she's proposing to do is to study 2 MDMA sessions. These are the 8-hour long sessions with 9 non-drug psychotherapy sessions versus 3 MDMA sessions with 12 non-drug psychotherapy sessions. And we're expecting to hear any day now from the FDA about this particular protocol. So this could be the transition of 30 years since 1990 trying to start research inside the VA. And then we're talking about a group therapy project that we're still trying to do fundraising for, but Brian Anderson at UC San Francisco, and this would be a LGBT plus people with PTSD, but we would explore it in a group process. And then we're not funding this, but we've done some training of Ben and his team, and this is going to be at Yale, connected to the West Haven VA, and they're also part of the National Center for PTSD by the VA. And this is going to be the first study taking PTSD patients, giving them MDMA and putting them in a scanner, and then comparing how they react to neutral scripts and trauma scripts to when they're in a scanner without MDMA. So I showed you some brain scan stuff before. So we had, PTSD patients have been scanned. Patients of ours have been scanned before and after therapy, but there's never been a PTSD patient under MDMA in the scanner. So Ben's going to be doing that with Lene Ponte, who used to be in charge of the Zendo project. We've also done studies. So our strategy is also that our main pipeline is going to be the use of MDMA for other things than PTSD, once PTSD is a medicine. So we've done social anxiety and adults on the autism spectrum with Charlie Grobe and Alicia Danforth. And this was also a really tremendously successful study with, this was a study with Phil Wilson with MDMA therapy for anxiety associated with life-threatening illnesses. Ben Sessa also got independent funding, but we've trained him and provided the MDMA, has done a study with alcoholism with MDMA, and the results are really good, but it's just short term. We really have to do the long-term follow-up to see how well that works. And we just got permission a week and a half ago from the FDA for a new study with MDMA for eating disorders at Adela France in Denver, but there'll be sites in Toronto and Vancouver as well. And there's some other things, very few things, but other things. Part of our strategy is to show beyond medicine that MDMA and ayahuasca psychedelics are really good for other things. And in particular, this is a study with conflict resolution in Israelis and Palestinians who are using ayahuasca and MDMA together. And it's just going to be really great to see. So once the drug is approved, how does it get regulated? And so what we're negotiating with the FDA is these REMS, risk evaluation and mitigation strategies. And because it's therapy, not the drug, the only people that will be able to prescribe it and treat patients are people that have been through our training program to learn the therapy component. We will eventually develop shorter training for prescribers than for therapists. If the prescribers don't want to be therapists themselves, it will only be administered in approved clinics under direct supervision. There'll be a centralized pharmacy that'll ship directly to the prescribers, not the patients, and there'll be certain kind of safety parameters. The things that are under the line are things that the FDA may impose. We're going to argue against them. They may impose a lifetime limit of the number of doses of MDMA you can get for PTSD and potentially a patient registry, but we're not sure if those are going to be required. But the main thing is it's going to be limited to trained therapists under supervision. Now, we're struggling with FDA right now about requirements for qualifications, credentials for therapy. At the present, the psilocybin people have to do research where they're a 2-person team. The lead person is MD, PhD, or the second person is a bachelor's degree. For us in phase 3, we have a licensed therapist or psychiatrist could be the lead person. The second person could be, has to have a bachelor's and needs to be either licensed or pursuing a license. So we're struggling to keep it this way. FDA has now been wanting to impose MD PhD on us for the lead therapist, and so we think that that's not going to stand. There's no justification for it, but this is going to impact post-approval. So our strategy is to make this to keep the two-person team, which I think is more effective and safer and provides kind of an apprenticeship, but it is more expensive, but to try to make the second person working for free to get hours for licensure or working for much less than the first person to keep it affordable. Let's see. Okay, somehow I can't advance. So I think that that's really, let's see, why can't I advance? I did have a few more slides. Let's just see what just happened. Well, I can tell you, I'm sort of running out of time, right? Anyway, so the main thing I just wanted to say here is that
3 minutes.
3 minutes. Okay, great. So I'll just keep it on this. I don't know why I can't go forward, but what I want to just share is that as part of our strategy, our real goal is mass mental health. It's not to maximize the amount of money that we make through selling MDMA. It's not just to stay within a medical frame. The goal is to have millions and billions of people have cleared out multi-generational trauma, to have spiritual experiences, to feel all connected, and to have a mentally healthy planet, which we are a long way from. And what that means is that medicalization will lead towards legalization. Medicalization changes people's attitudes about the risk benefits of drugs. We've seen that in medical marijuana. And here, I might as well stop the share so you can see. So we've seen that in medical marijuana, and we believe that will be the case with psychedelics. So roughly 2022, 2023 is when we think we're going to have FDA approval. We'll also get approval in Israel and in Canada, and then a decade or so of rolling out psychedelic clinics. And so we were in, and then people's attitudes were changing, and I think somewhere like 2035 we'll move towards a licensed legalization system. And at present, we have Denver has made mushrooms the lowest enforcement priority. Oakland, through interaction with our policy team, decided to move that broader to decriminalizing nature, plant psychedelics. Oregon is going to be on the ballot for a psilocybin initiative to provide opportunities for ways for not just patients, but healthy people for personal growth to have access to sort of semi-regulated therapists regulated by the state. So while we are primarily focused on medicalization, and the advantage of medicalization is that insurance companies will cover it, but there's also personal growth, all sorts of use, vision quests, midlife crisis, what's your purpose in life, couples therapy, which is not a disease. So we really need to move beyond. And so that's part of our bigger strategy. And my basic view is that the work that is being done on broader drug policy reform is not a threat to the research that we're doing. Some people think that. Some other researchers tend to think that. And they say we shouldn't do anything about that. J.R. Ron from Mind Medicine just said, I want nothing to do with those kind of folks that want to decriminalize psychedelics. But I think it makes it more mainstream and moderate what we're trying to do. So Amy becomes not a radical anymore, who's a refugee from big pharma working with these crazy psychedelics. Now she's just a mainstream, middle of the road kind of drug developer happening to work with psychedelics, and the crazies are over there trying to, decriminalize and stuff. So I think that effort is legitimizes what we're doing, makes it more important, and also it responds to the fundamental human rights crisis, which is that drugs should never have been criminalized in the first place. So there we go.
Yay.
Thank you,
Good
Via.
job.
So you're not going to hit me. I did it in time. And
It was just about to, let's pass to the non-radical, how is it that you
The
said?
middle of the road, not, I don't know if I like that introduction, Rick.
no, it is kind of it diminishes your magic.
Yeah, go ahead, Amy. Welcome,
Okay.
and thank you.
Thank you. All right, let me see if I can share my presentation correctly here. Okay. So Rick has told you quite a bit about our program. I don't know how he fits so much information into such a short amount of time, but I'm going to go a little bit slower and dive in a little bit deeper on a few things. So right now, as you have heard, and probably know, we're in the middle of our phase 3 program, and it's a really pivotal point in our history. We've been at this for a very long time with the mission to test the effectiveness of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy to treat PTSD. It's taken us, 34 years, Rick? 34, 35 years to get to this point of being in phase 3. I started working with Rick in 2003, so I've been at this for half as long as Rick has. And it's been, it's always a long road to get to phase 3 or to get a new drug approved, but it's been a little longer and windier for us doing this as a nonprofit and needing to raise the money along the way and deal with working with a stigmatized drug. So phase 3 is where we're at currently. And I just want to tell you a little bit about what the phases of drug development are. So you usually have preclinical, where you're doing discovery, you find something that looks promising, it goes into phase 1. Phase 1 studies are small. They're to look at what is the dose, what is the metabolism of the dose in the body, and some of the safety. And you're doing this usually in healthy, normal adults. We didn't have to do too much with phase 1 before we started our phase 2 program, because a lot of that research was done by, supported by NIDA and other researchers at the beginning when they were trying to prove the dangers of MDMA, which didn't really pan out, but it really helped us a lot to jump forward into the next phase. We are going back now and doing some phase 1 studies on metabolism that we need to do for our final NDA package that we'll need to include. So we jumped into phase 2, and phase 2 is like small to medium-sized clinical trials, and you're collecting further safety, you're looking for signals of efficacy, and you're really looking at the best way to administer the drug to maximize your possible benefits and minimize your risks. And we did 12 phase 2 studies during our program. And now, as I said, we're in phase 3. Phase 3 is a little bit larger. You're really looking at your safety. You're looking at your whole safety profile, what's going to go into your label of your drug when it's approved, and you're looking at efficacy in a slightly larger population. And phase 2 and phase 3 are both patient populations that are in the indication that you're trying to treat. So for us, PTSD. When your phase 3 is complete, you analyze all of your data together, and you look to see, does it have a demonstrated efficacy and an acceptable safety profile to treat the indication that you're studying? If yes, then you go for your NDA. And this is how you get your drug approved for prescription treatments. And then usually there's some commitments when you do your NDA and you get approval for you to look in a phase 4. So phase 4 is post-approval, but it's some ongoing research. For us, that might include looking at people who have relapsed or that were initially non-responders, or to looking at additional doses, or treatments, maybe follow-up treatments like a year later. We don't know. We'll negotiate that with FDA. So that's kind of where we're at in this whole process. Uh-oh, I'm not moving my slides here. Here we go. Okay, so what's a currently available treatment that we're being kind of measured against as we do our drug development program? Well, right now there's pharmacotherapies and psychotherapies that are available. The current therapies work for some people, but many are really left with treatment-resistant symptoms. About 40 to 60% of people with PTSD respond to a currently available treatment. And that's pretty much antidepressants. These require daily dosing, and they're really about just trying to diminish the symptoms that you have, and they have significant side effects. So many people don't even try a pharmacotherapy, or they try a pharmacotherapy and then they go off of them. And many people in our studies have tried many pharmacotherapies, and they've also tried psychotherapy. These are some of the psychotherapies that are available, and they are effective for many people, but they also have high dropout rates. These psychotherapies are really difficult. People have to go through and process these traumatic memories in order to get through the treatment, and this is just many times too difficult for people. As kind of further evidence that the current treatments are not working so well, this slide demonstrates that in 1999, what our spending was on psychiatric drugs, and that it's increased 3.7 times since then, up to 2014, and even more since then. So we're spending tons more on drugs. But if you look in lockstep, one of the main symptoms of people with psychiatric disorders and PTSD is suicide, and that is going up just as much as the drug spending is going up. So I think this is just a nice way to demonstrate that what we have out there is not working so well. Why do we think that we can do better than this? Well, we have a quite different approach, right? So first, we have a medication and a psychotherapy, and we're combining them. And our medication happens to make the psychotherapy piece a bit easier so people can get through the psychotherapy. We also don't have a daily dosing drug. It's used 3 times. We consider the set and setting of the treatment to be very important. All the visits are in a nice and supportive setting that looks, all the treatment rooms look a little different, but this is a nice example of one. It's like a nice, comfortable living room that you would feel good spending 8 hours in. And all of the participants in the studies have 2 therapists with them. So Rick had said male and female. I saw some people commenting on that. That's not a firm requirement anymore. We started off with male and female therapy teams, but we have mixed and matched in our phase 3 studies and as we're going forward. Music is also part of the set and setting. We offer eye shades and headphones, and we allow people to really have time to go into their inner process. So the MDMA creates what we call like these areas of windows of tolerance, where your symptoms that you're experiencing from PTSD are reduced. So you're able to start to have more trust in yourself and in the therapists during your treatment process. And you're able to start to look back at those traumatic memories without so much fear and with more trust and empathy for yourself. And we call this process an inner directed process. And our therapists are there to support the patients in this experience and allow them to express whatever is emerging into their awareness and to really to bring forward into the treatment whatever best meets the person where they're at during that time. This is what we call allowing them to access their inner healing intelligence that may know better than the therapist or better than like our cognitive mind about where the process needs to go in order to create healing. So another reason we think we can do better than what's available out there is because we actually have data about how our process works. And we also had a lot of history prior to us even starting these studies of people working in the underground or working in traditional ways with psychedelics to show that they are very powerful tools. But of course, we can't just use that with FDA. So we had to do phase 2 studies. And as I mentioned, we did 12 of these phase 2 studies. And these results allowed us to not only move on to phase 3 where we're at now, but to do so with something called breakthrough therapy designation, meaning that this data showed FDA and they recognized that our therapy is a breakthrough as compared to these available treatments that are currently there for PTSD, which I kind of just reviewed with you and how inadequate they are for many, many people. So when we did our 12 studies, we combined all of the data together and we looked and we had a 30.4 point reduction in the severity of PTSD symptoms as measured by the CAPS. The CAPS is a gold standard measure of severity of PTSD symptoms. So from the baseline here, where people were starting out with very severe PTSD, chronic treatment resistant PTSD, they were able to drop after 2 treatments significantly down and then further after a 3rd treatment. We saw that 78% of people had a clinically significant response and 53% of people had complete remission. And these were people that had on average had PTSD for 18 years prior to starting the study and had tried many treatments. So another reason that we think we can do better than what's available is that not only did we have those good results after 2 and 3 sessions, but we went and looked again at something that we call long-term follow-up to see about the durability of our results. So 12 months after treatment, we checked with the CAPS again, and we saw not only had people's responses held, but there were 67% of people now that were in remission, and only 2 people had relapsed. So this is very good news. This is not just some afterglow effect that people are having a good response soon after treatment. It's lasting to our primary endpoint, which is 2 months after treatment, and then to even 1 year later. And many of the people, when we did this follow-up, actually it was much longer than 1 year. I think it was I think there was up to like 3 to 5 years for some of the people had been out since their last treatment. So we used this data that we had gathered in phase 2 to design a phase 3 program. We went to FDA with our phase 2 data, we got breakthrough therapy, and then we worked with them to design the phase 3 and then to negotiate really the whole phase 3 program with them. So what we came up with was a phase 3 treatment that involves 3 day-long MDMA therapy sessions that are about a month apart, and 12 90-minute non-drug therapy sessions, for integration. There's 3 prior to them starting their treatment, and these are preparatory sessions. And then each drug therapy session is followed by 3 integration visits. And the integration is a really important part of the treatment. It allows people to really go into the experience that they had during the drug sessions and the insights that they have, and have the therapist help them to understand, make sense of them, and start to apply them to their daily lives, so that they don't get lost. These insights that they have during the therapy sessions don't get lost, and they can really be integrated into the person's life. So when people enter our study, they're randomized. They either end up in the MDMA arm or in a placebo arm. And the MDMA arm is MDMA assisted psychotherapy, and the placebo arm is basically just psychotherapy. So it's a placebo plus psychotherapy. This is different than other drug studies where you would have a completely inactive comparator. When the people are randomized, they stay in the arm that they're randomized to for the entire study. So they'll either have 3 MDMA sessions or 3 placebo assisted psychotherapy sessions. The treatment takes place over about 15 weeks. And our primary assessment with the CAPS is about 2 months after their last treatment session. So as I said, the study is randomized, but it's also blinded. So these are some of the components of a phase 3 study that the FDA wants in order to create bias minimization in looking in the results that you generate. So it's difficult, as you could imagine, to blind a study of MDMA. So how did we address the problem of the blind? There was no other comparator that would really confuse people. And we didn't want to compare to a completely inactive treatment because that would be too obvious. So we came up with, at least there's the psychotherapy is held consistent between the 2 arms, and then people get either MDMA or placebo. But if you're in the room or you're the person receiving it, it tends to be fairly obvious which arm you're in. So we decided to use an independent rater group that are well trained in the CAPS. They're trained by the National Center for PTSD. They work on many PTSD studies, and they do, by telemedicine, the CAPS assessment. So they're never in the room during the treatment sessions. They're never able to see what the person's experience was like. And the CAPS raters rarely ever see the same participant twice. So the participants come in at various times during the study baseline, and then at various times, and then 2 months after their last treatment, and they see a different rater each time. So this was an acceptable way to deal with the blind in our studies, acceptable to FDA, and to minimize the bias in our data generation. And then people that are in that placebo arm, don't worry, we offer them to complete the study with MDMA in an unblinded way once the phase 3 studies are over. So everybody that enters the study will have the option to have MDMA treatment. So that was the design in the phase 3. And then that's the clinical trial design. And then we have a whole program. So the phase 3 program consists of 2 phase 3 studies, each of them of 100 participants. And these are called our pivotal. Our first one, MAP 1, is our pivotal study, and MAP 2 is our confirmatory study. These, compared to phase 2 were single site studies, and they're much smaller. This is a large study with 15 sites in the US, Canada, and Israel. And the same sites will participate in the first phase 3 and in the second phase 3. You're required to have 2 positive phase 3s to get a drug approval in most cases. Some companies take more than 2 studies to get 2 positive ones. They might have 2 out of 5 that are positive. We're really hopeful, partly because of the results that I showed you from phase 2 and partly some other information I'll share with you in a minute, that we really only will take 2 phase 3 studies in the US, Canada, and Israel to be successful. And then we'll do a 3rd phase 3 in Europe in order to expand our approvals. Let's see. We also include in these phase 3 studies an adaptive design that lets us check partway through if we think that the way we designed it, the number of people, that's called the sample size, that are in each of these studies is appropriate. So that's the stage that we're at right now in MAP 1, and we're just getting ready to start MAP 2. But we need to wait until some of this, there's some more better understanding of when we can restart based on the COVID and the social distancing that's happening right now. So another bit, so we started this phase 3 program with these 2 phase 3 studies, first by doing a lead-in. So as I said, we went from having very small phase 2 studies where we had single sites to a large phase 3 with 15 sites and a lot of new therapists. We felt pretty good about the idea that we would be able to replicate these results with new therapy teams, but we weren't positive. So we started off with each of the sites and each of the teams at a site seeing 1 person, open label, MDMA, 3 sessions, and they were able to go through supervision with our training team, and we were able to collect the results of that. So 1 study per team. And again, we saw incredible results. Again, a 30-point reduction from baseline to post-treatment. So this really gave us a lot of hope that the way we were designing our phase 3 was going to be successful, because we had now reproduced our phase 2 results with a whole new set of therapists, which was pretty exciting for us. We also were able to start to collect a little bit more safety data during this time. And it's great to talk about the positive results, but we are still only in clinical trial, and part of a clinical trial is not to just look for effectiveness, but to look for safety. So some of the safety that we saw in phase 2 and then in this study were transient increases in heart rate and blood pressure, but not more than really what's comparable to heavy exercise, and all self-limited and returning to baseline. Increases in psychological distress during the therapy sessions as people start processing their trauma. Some increases in suicidal ideation. And this is also most likely a part of the process of processing their trauma. And we don't know right now if it's equal in the MDMA and placebo groups, but we think it probably is. Some other types of adverse events that we see are anxiety, tight jaw, headache, some lack of appetite, fatigue, restlessness, just really nothing that's very concerning is coming up in the safety profile so far. But the phase 3 will let us be more definitive about what we think our side effects are, because we'll have results in the placebo arm versus the MDMA arm in a blinded study that will be able to compare the rates of events. So this is a little bit about what our regulatory plan looks like to get MDMA approved, not only in the US, but in other countries. So each of the MAPS studies includes this adaptive design, which is where we're at right now. And that allows us to double check and make sure that we're designing our studies appropriately. And we'll use that information to also help us design a phase 3 program in Europe. So at this point, like I mentioned, MAP 1, which is our pivotal study in the US, is completely enrolled. And we're at the interim analysis point, and you should be looking soon for some information on that interim analysis that we'll be sharing. And we're getting ready to start our confirmatory study. This will be followed up by a crossover of people that are in the placebo arm getting to go into the active dose arm, and then also a long-term follow-up to see if the results are durable. This is our phase 3 program for US, Canada, and Israel, and will allow us to do a regulatory application for approval if the results are positive, and this is in about 200 subjects. We're going to take that data also to Europe, and in Europe, we're only going to do one small confirmatory study because we'll be able to leverage all the data that was gathered in the US, Canada, and Israel study and apply that across some of the European countries to as a confirmatory. So we'll use that, and it's about 70 people in that, combined with our initial data of MAP 1 and MAP 2 to make another regulatory package. What's really exciting is that you get to really leverage all of that data, and if you have approvals in those countries, for something called mutual recognition. So here's some potential countries that we would take that data with. We would do no additional phase 3 studies, but we would take that data to Australia, Colombia, Brazil, Chile, other places, and see if we can get approval in those countries based on our approvals in US and Europe. That's a really important part because it's really expensive and really labor intensive and really long to do these studies. So we want to make the most use of the data that's possible and the most use of the donor money that comes in to support these studies by getting as many approvals as possible with as few phase 3s as needed. These are all the places that around the world that also have regulatory agencies, and some of them will have this mutual recognition program. And some of them may require a small phase 3 or an additional phase 2 study for us to get approval. So in preparing for what we hope is success and what we're feeling pretty good about, we also have a therapist training program. And last year in our therapy training program, we had over 600 therapist applicants. We have trained 353 therapists, and we've certified 73. The certification means that they've gone through supervision and they've treated their first participant. So that number will increase as we have more clinical trials and people are able to treat a PTSD participant and receive supervision. Those certifications will go up. This year, spending a lot of time on figuring out how we can scale our training program. And we will be having more and more applications coming in and more training available, and increasing the number of trainers that we also have available as we have more experience in the program. In parallel with phase 3, I just want to end on this, which is our expanded access program. So we tried for quite some time to get this protocol approved, and it came through in January, which was pretty exciting. Expanded access is a compassionate use, and you're able to do this in parallel with phase 3. So the compassionate use studies are outside of the phase 3 sites that we're currently working on. We'd be adding 10 more sites and 50 more people with PTSD that would be able to get treatment prior to the drug being approved. And then once we have about 30 of the 50 people treated in expanded access, we'll go back to FDA and ask for more. And we'll keep trying to expand the number of therapists that we have and the number of sites that we have and the number of people that are treated in parallel to us seeking approval for the drug as a prescription. So I think that's all that I have to share. I don't know, I think I even stayed in my time, Bia.
Yeah, that was good. Two minutes ahead. So thank you, both of you. I hope you know the webinar is aimed for the most naive until the most nerdy psychonaut. And so it's a big arc that we try to cover. And I hope, you know, the public understands this need to give some basic info and go into more details. And what the immediate reaction that I think all of us get out of this is that this has been a journey. It's been 34 years and $80 billion, million, sorry, I confuse numbers, but it seems a lot of money. $80 million and 34 years. And so if we're really looking into like 2022 and 2023 for regulation, I mean, it's, you know, we're on the verge. And I think that's why there's so much momentum and the field is growing so dynamic and so strong. So MAPS has been a pioneer in leading the way, and there's also a lot of research and clinical trials with psilocybin, and it's a new reality. We are on the cusp of something, you know, a transformation, and I think all of us that are in the field are puzzled and a little bit almost nauseous or confused or excited and thrilled with what's ahead. And I wanted to make, I have a tradition of making little jokes with Rick. I thought it was interesting that you mentioned that women have higher rates of PTSD, but you decided to like go through the veterans route because it brings a lot of, you know, legitimacy to go treat PTSD in veterans, and they have a lot of credits in society. Maybe, you know, as we move forward, we could consider in the celebration of this advancement of the studies to go back to these other populations and also launch other studies talking about this traumas with women and all of that.
I have to defend for a minute. Wait, like our first study was mostly women. And
all right.
Very few vets. We've done only one study that was focused on vets. And that was partly because there was a point in time when they thought maybe PTSD from military trauma had to have a different treatment than other types of PTSD. That is not the case. And so all of our studies are PTSD from any cause. They're at least half women so far. And we will be, and that is what we're looking for approval for this drug, is PTSD of any cause at any severity.
Okay,
Rick, go ahead.
Thank you. Not just veterans.
Not just veterans, no.
All right. I think I misunderstood what Rick said then. What did you want to clarify what you said, Rick?
Well, just that veterans get most of the attention, but more than half of our people are women. Yeah, so I just was commenting, it's a little bit sad the way our society doesn't seem to value those kind of traumas as much as they value veterans with traumas.
Okay, all right. Thank you for clarifying that. I wanted to ask both of you a question about personal use and how important you think it is that the therapist has firsthand experience with MDMA.
Well, I don't think it's essential, but I think it's about as close to extremely important. So I think real good therapists who are trauma-informed therapists can be helpful to people with MDMA, even if they've never done it themselves. However, I think that if they do MDMA, then they'll be even more helpful. So it's not like only therapists who've done MDMA they're all better than all the therapists who've never done MDMA. I just think each person themselves would be more effective if they've done it. So I think we are going to struggle to continue to make it as an option for therapists, and we will encourage people to do it. It's the most expensive part of our training program, but I also think it's extremely valuable.
What about you, Amy?
I think it's very valuable. It's one of the things in our training program, like Rick said, that the therapist found was one of the most valuable parts. And I think that there's something that happens where therapists a lot of times are trained to do something, right? To kind of to push the therapy along maybe in a certain way and to be very active in it. And it's hard to go back and trust that the medicine is doing a lot of that work and the own person's inner healing intelligence is being activated and helping to create the best route for healing. But if you experience that yourself, if you have the experience of going in and going, oh, wow, a lot is happening, even when you're being quiet and there's a lot that's being revealed to me, you're going to trust that process even more when you're sitting for someone than if somebody tells you that that's what's happening.
Yeah, I agree with you guys. I don't know if you feel comfortable with this next question, so feel free not to decline to answer. But I think it's a lot of people are curious on whether you have either tried MDMA or have experienced the MAPS training yourselves and have anything to share.
About 120 times I've tried MDMA, something like that. I've kind of lost count, but that's over almost, almost 40 years. So
have you tried to do the session like MAP style?
I have, yeah, not as part of our formal program, but as part of my therapy a while ago. Yeah, and I've been to the MAPS trainings. Actually, it's some of my favorite things to do. I feel like it's such a great thing because my goal, of course, is to become a psychedelic therapist legally, full-time at some point, once we've made all these things into medicines and we have psychedelic clinics. So the trainings are very helpful and informative, and I just love being at them. And I'm shocked that anybody, I don't think that question was probably directed at Amy. I'm shocked that anybody would think that I haven't.
No, I would like to know, people, people would like to know what do you feel personally you have, gained in treating
Well, that's a separate question.
It's an open question. Well, maybe we don't need to go into all of it. Let's go back to Amy for now.
I'll just say one thing, which is the most mystical experience of my entire life was under the influence of MDMA, surprisingly. Even though I've taken LSD loads of times, mescaline, ayahuasca, all this, I would say the most mystical experience of my life was under MDMA. So I've gained an awful lot. I can say that, here's another way to say it. I will never be able to pay back through all my work at MAPS all I have gained from my psychedelic use.
Wow.
I like the answers.
I do feel like personal experience is valuable, and I wouldn't be here if I didn't know the value myself of these medicines.
Okay, I agree. I also identify with that answer.
We can also say that we have early times of my relationship with Amy were at Burning Man.
I want to tell everybody that we are also going to have another session about PTSD and trauma and MDMA and the study of the octopus. We're going to talk about that. So that's down our calendar in our, I believe, last webinar session. So keep on tuned because that's coming up again. I'm going to take some questions here from the public, and I just want to excuse my English because I am not a native speaker, and sometimes I don't read the perfect way. So somebody is asking, where and when can I enroll in therapy training program? What background is needed, required?
Well, I'll say where and when. There's going to be the next training. Things have been, of course, interrupted by COVID. So the next training was going to be with a group of people at the Bronx VA in July as part of this process with Rachel Yehuda and her team. But now it looks like that will be shortened and done online. And then hopefully they'll get together at a later time. So we don't really have any other trainings really prepared. There's the California Institute for Integral Studies has a certificate program in helping people understand psychedelic research and treatment. And we have sort of imported the week-long in-person training program into that CIS program. So everybody gets that, gets our a portion of our training program. We call that Part B. But we're preparing to scale up the number of people that we train, and also we're trying to focus now on training more trainers. So you can go to the MAPS website and sign up, and we can send you emails when the program opens up again. But I'm not sure exactly when we're going to have training. It'll probably be near the end of this year or so.
Yeah. You can check the website for updated information from the training team.
Yeah, but I would say that our treatment manual, which you can learn a lot from, which describes our therapeutic approach, it's up on the MAPS website for free. So, you know, again, it's part of our transparency and sharing information. It's not copyrighted or anything like that. So you just go to the research menu bar, you go to MDMA, it's down at the bottom of that page is the treatment manual. And I think that will be really helpful to people to understand our therapeutic approach.
I got a question for Amy. What efforts are you making to have more diversity in the studies?
I think that that's really going to come with expanded access. I mean, we have done a lot of outreach within the phase 3 studies, but part of the complication of that is that you also have to have outreach to therapists, right? So you need to create more diversity within your therapists, and you need that in order to create more diversity in your patient population, especially when you're dealing with trauma, possibly race-based trauma, sex-based trauma, that there's gender-based traumas that, you know, what we have heard from so many of the therapists is that you can do more damage than good if you're going into if you're just increasing your diversity without also increasing your ability to treat the people that are coming to you from a more diverse background in an appropriate way. Also, I think clinical trials are difficult a lot of times for increasing diversity, and there's a lot of distrust of enrolling in a research study. And my hope is that we have more time to be expanding who gets our training right now, reaching out to more people, providing more training, and then through expanded access, increasing the sites and the locations of the sites that are going to have more outreach, and the therapists that can do that outreach. It should come from, I think it should come from the therapist and the communities. And then, you know, we really want to keep partnering with therapists in different areas of how to do outreach to communities so that we have something, that we have more of a foundation in this before we get to approval. But this is something that never ends, right? This is something that you constantly have to keep working at, and will constantly now and post-approval be something that we all have to work at.
Yeah, I just was in a meeting with colleagues from our Chakrina Institute today, and they were mentioning exactly this, like a training, the problem of trainings is that people often feel they did a training and then, you know, they arrived at it and they're, you know, they check and so they're an expert. So it's more complex and ongoing. I want to tell people that MAPS has trained, created a special training for people of color. In Kentucky last July or so, August in Kentucky. I also want to refer to a special edition journal that I co-edited with my colleague, Dr. Monica Williams, talking about equity, access, and diversity. That's in the field of psychedelics. It's available for free online. And so there's a whole discussion that needs to advance and happen. I'm going to read another question. It's a double question. Can you talk about the risks of serotonin depletion after MDMA therapy? I feel incredibly depressed after my session of psilocybin followed by MDMA with experienced guide. That's an anonymous question, and there's one related. Can you talk about my new research? Can you talk about any new research or what we know now about MDMA neurotoxicity?
Yeah. So first off, we see no evidence whatsoever of MDMA neurotoxicity in the few sessions that we give at the doses that we give. And the evidence for neurotoxicity has never been about cell death. It's about nerve terminal degeneration, and it happens at doses above what we're giving. The more important question is functional consequences. Brain changes are one thing, but are brain changes good? Are they bad? What are functional consequences? So we've done neurocognitive tests on two different groups in our two different phase 2 studies, before and after, trying to see if there are any neurocognitive declines. If you look at the literature for neurotoxicity, you know, which we've summarized. The other thing you could look at is our investigator's brochure, which summarizes the world's literature on MDMA. There's all sections on neurotoxicity. But what we found is that there are no evidence of neurocognitive consequences. It just doesn't seem to be relevant. And even if there were some, you know, it's always risk benefit. It doesn't have to be perfect, but we don't see any evidence. This thing about the day after, we tell people that MDMA is a 2-day experience, 1 day to do it, the second day to rest. And I think that's the best thing that we are able to tell people. And we don't find that people have this in the MDMA group more than in the placebo group, more of this kind of, you know, post-MDMA depression, anxiety. It doesn't seem to happen. When we went to the FDA at the very beginning, we were talking about this whole issue, and should we give 5-HTP or something like that, supplements with MDMA, which there's some suggestions that will reduce neurotoxicity in animals, or a lot of people have tried it on their own to see that it makes the come down easier. And the FDA said, don't do that. First off, see what are the problems from MDMA by itself before you start giving something else to correct a problem that you haven't demonstrated in clinical research. And so in all of our studies, we do not give any kind of supplements. People can take them on their own if they want to, but I think the main thing is the next day. And I would also just add that there's been
hydration, Rick.
Oh, yes, hydration is really important. You also have to worry about too much hydration. People have died from hyponatremia, but the best hydration is not water. It's something with electrolytes. Like, so you hear all this harm reduction advice about water, but really that's not so smart. A lot of times water is all you get and it's free, but something with electrolytes is better. But I would say that the MDMA LSD combination or the MDMA psilocybin combination can be incredibly therapeutic. And I don't know that there's, you know, I've had experience in both ways with it, and it doesn't seem like it's more draining than just doing MDMA by itself.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's interesting. We see a lot of people have improvement in sleep right away, but again, I think it's different when you're dealing with a PTSD population than when you're dealing with, and and then the sets and settings. Now, this person's question said they were doing it with a guide in an intentional way, but we just don't see like kind of what the common complaints are. We don't see it in the clinical trials. People sleep well a lot of times the first night, maybe the first time they've had good sleep in a while, where they don't have nightmares. So it's like you're dealing with a different, again, it's to the PTSD population that I'm talking about. And then you might see some changes in mood, but it's more based on that they're starting to process the trauma. It's related more to the therapy than it is to the drug.
Okay. We have all kinds of questions here. What are your observations on how the 1% are engaging with the shift in global consciousness? How can psychedelics help the ruling elite partner in dismantling the power structures they benefit from?
Well, I'll say that first off, we do have a lot of connections with the 1%, but that's because of failure of government. The National Institute of Mental Health hasn't funded a penny of our research. The Veterans Administration has not funded a penny of our research. The traditional foundations are running the other way still, although that's going to be changing. We've foundations that we've got funds from have been ones where the founders, the wealth generators, are making the decisions. We've not got money from direct staff-driven foundations, although again, hopefully this will change. But the 1% is the same as the 99% in the sense of they're all vulnerable to coronavirus. They're vulnerable to, although less so, you know, through their money could protect them, but they're vulnerable through global warming, nuclear war, all of that. So I think there's just the 1% is a range of political views. That's what I tried to show early. George Soros is the 1%, Rebecca Mercer is the 1%, but they're united on this focus on healing and on therapy. And I think that's what's really important. And I think it's really a mischaracterization to think that if you've got a lot of money, you are somehow or other of a certain political kind of orientation. Is that a good answer?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, people are not necessarily criticizing MAP's choices with funding. They were also just curious on, are we going to be able to, like, how is psychedelics going to be able to be effective in reshaping power structures of society?
Yeah. Well, and I'll just add one little comment on that, which is that when you have this, these kind of unitive experiences that you can get with psychedelics, that you realize that you're not so separate from everybody else. You're not so different from people that are a different color, a different race, different gender, different nationality, different religion. You're more, yeah, you know, I just read the other day, you know, chimpanzees are 97 to 99% the amount of the same DNA as humans. You know, we're not that different. And so I think whether you're 1% or whatever, when you have these unitive kind of experiences, when you go beyond your ego orientation, that will have compassionate political implications.
Awesome. You want to say anything about this, Amy? Oops, I lost her.
Sorry.
All right, yeah, you were muted.
I don't really have anything to add to that so much of like, I feel like there's that piece of it where when we do our own work and we have our own healing, that we have more capacity to then care about the healing of our community and other people. And that I think psychedelics can be a big part of that, of helping us heal ourselves so that we have that capacity to care about the healing of our fellow humans and the planet and the environment and, you know, so.
Yeah, I always wonder, Rick refers to you as a, I don't know which word, a refugee or something of the big pharma.
Yeah.
Or why would a fine lady like you drop out of big pharma and go do this hustling in a nonprofit that you have to constantly fundraise to self-fund your own studies? What is your dream? Why are you doing this work? What is there for you? Why did you sign up?
That's a good question. And I don't feel like a refugee. I loved the work that I did in public health. Another controversial area of working in vaccine development for meningitis. So maybe I just like controversy. But when I heard Rick speaking in like the late 90s and the early 2000s is when I became aware of psychedelic research renaissance. I went to, a little bit at Burning Man. Mostly I picked up a piece of trash that talked about the Mind States conference in Berkeley. And I was like, what is this? I must go. So I went, and lo and behold, there's a whole group of people talking about psychedelics that I just didn't even have. I didn't realize that I had access to. And they were right there in my own hometown. And so I started really paying a lot more attention to the conversations that were going on. I heard Rick talk about wanting to start a nonprofit pharmaceutical research company for MDMA for PTSD. And my husband and I were listening to him talk. And I looked at my husband and I said, I have to help him do this because I understood the drug development process. I was not working in trauma and psychotherapy and psychiatry, nothing. Like, that is not my background, but I understood the drug development process. I had my own personal experiences that made me feel like these tools were so important to bring to people. And there was just like a moment of truth when I heard Rick talking about this, that I knew I had to somehow be a part of it and help, and it happened. Here I still am.
Yeah, one of my favorite stories is that Amy said, I'd like to help you monitor your studies. And I said, what's monitoring? I didn't know. Now I know.
Yeah, I think a lot of us feel that.
That's not Rick's forte, to follow all the rules and regulations, but he is very visionary. He's the rest of us to help make sure that we follow the rules and regulations so all of it's acceptable to FDA.
Yeah, definitely takes a whole team. And I also resonate with you as a moment of just feeling this truth and this calling and this vision and this passion. And I think the data that you put up about depression and suicide, I mean, it's so overwhelming. We have so many millions of people suffering in our world, and these are so much incredible tools. And I think all of us that have been touched about this just kind of want to serve. I very much resonate with that. I like to make a little joke that psychedelics are not addictive, but research about psychedelics is pretty addictive, because it's very fascinating also how do you build this knowledge and kind of translate it into a scientific language, this kind of ineffable and magical and power, realm. So thanks for sharing that, Amy. I have another question. Have researchers at MAPS started exploring which types of therapy may be most compatible with psychedelic assisted therapy? For example, at the Psychedelic Science Summit, compatible. I knew I was almost close. For example, at the Psychedelic Science Summit, presenters discussed combining cognitive processing therapy with MDMA assisted therapy.
Well, that's one of the slides that I showed was Ann Wagner, who's going to do a study combining cognitive processing therapy with MDMA. I think that when we did the cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy combination with MDMA, what they ended up finding was that the kind of instructional components of cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy ended up being delivered in the preparation and in the integration, and the MDMA session itself looked more and more like our model. And so I personally think that there are a lot of different therapeutic approaches, but the ones that seem most compatible with psychedelics are the ones that have this, at the core of it, this trust in the inner healer, that it's patient, inner directed, as Amy was saying before. It's directed by the content as it flows from the individual. It's not a scripted thing put down on top of them with exercises that they must do with a certain kind of logic to it. there's kind of an inner logic to this inner intelligence that brings things to the surface, and it's supportive rather than directive, and it's following rather than leading in certain ways. And so I think when you look at the treatment manual, it's very similar to how the psilocybin or LSD therapy would be administered, except for the main difference is that people are a lot more verbal with MDMA, and there's a lot more interaction with the therapists during the MDMA than during LSD or psilocybin or ibogaine or things like that. But one reason that we're funding so many of these combination studies, as I mentioned, is just really to educate VA researchers and leaders and the thought leaders in PTSD. But the other is maybe they'll figure out some way to make it better or optimize it. So we're not saying that necessarily we've stumbled on or created the optimum approach, but it does feel like an open-ended, inner-directed, supportive therapeutic approach is what I think works best with psychedelics.
Yeah, we also, have a lot of young students that are watching this webinar, and we suggest people take research topics like review the literature, perhaps do a map of what has been studied. There's so much potential, so much to be done. And so, that's also what we try to advocate here, that if you want to be a psychedelic researcher, there's a huge universe. We're very much on the beginning, and there's endless potentialities. That's a good topic. I will do another one. In the event that phase 3 MDMA studies prove efficacy, what risks or barriers, if any, do you see that might still slow the process of medicalization in the US? Tyler asks.
I don't see any. So if the phase 3 studies show efficacy, okay, so that was the question. The other flip side of that, of course, is safety. So we have to show safety as well as efficacy. But if we show that, we're on a path to approval. And the thing that we did after we got breakthrough therapy, which Amy had mentioned, was this period of time that we engaged in what's called special protocol assessment process with FDA. And that delayed things about 8 months, but we negotiated every aspect of the phase 3 design and all the supplemental materials and information that FDA would want. Amy mentioned we're going back and getting some more animal data and different things. But we have it all agreed on. We reached agreement. We have a formal, what's called agreement letter. FDA is legally bound to approve MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD if we get 2 phase 3 studies that are statistically significant and we have an acceptable safety profile. So I think the bipartisan funding support, the veteran community, the thought leaders in the PTSD treatments, I think that I learned about LSD really in 1971 and 72 after the backlash. I learned about MDMA before the backlash, but I saw a backlash. Our Zendo project, our psychedelic harm reduction, was designed to prevent a backlash, a political backlash. And now it would come from parents worrying about their kids. I think it's no longer about counterculture or Timothy Leary, drop out, and go live on a commune and stuff like that and oppose the Vietnam War. I think it's really about parents worrying about their kids. And, the Zendo project, of course, doesn't resolve all of that, but it shows there's a model, a harm reduction model that we could put into place. And so I think our biggest challenge is fundraising right now, because there are lots and lots of people who want to invest, and we don't want that. We want to be a model for how we operate pharma in a public benefit maximizing way rather than profit maximizing way.
I thought maybe that part of the question was related to rescheduling, because it's a Schedule 1, it will be rescheduled. I think DEA has like 90 days post-approval to reschedule, and it happens automatically in about half of the states. And then in the other half of the states, there's either a legislative or administrative action to reschedule it, but it will happen across all of the states. And then I think another barrier is just expanding the training program to train more therapists so that we can cover more need, and then working really closely with payers, because we want access. We want access for all people. And so that's going to be a lot of work. So I would say some of those are things that I think of when I hear the word barriers.
And I know there has been some moves around MAPS PBC, new hiring, new leadership position. Can you talk about anything about what's going internally and like challenges with the institution, and how do you see this new phase that we have, like new leadership in both MAPS and MAPS PBC? How are you watching MAPS growth as an institution, Amy?
Well, we've done everything in a very stripped down way for a long time. But with the success we're having and with being in phase 3, there's a lot more complexity. And a lot more complexity as you think about going to the next steps of a post-approval and patient access. So we are growing a lot internally to support not only the phase 3, but other initiatives and other indications, because we don't want this for just PTSD. We want it for other indications. So we're supporting other studies. We're looking at other drugs that will possibly develop in the future for other indications also. So that takes a lot of infrastructure. Having the drug no longer made at Purdue in the lab, but actually a manufacturer that's up to the standards for GMP. Our drug was amazing that we've had used for all of our phase 2, but there's a new standard that you have to hit when you go to phase 3 and then post-approval. So it takes a lot of infrastructure to support all of this, to figure out what your distribution pathway is, to the clinics, to figure out your REMS. So we have an opening for a commercial and patient access leadership role. We have finance roles that are open. We're growing our individual departments within the research organization to keep supporting the complexity that's happening as we go towards an NDA. An NDA is an incredible amount of work to do. So once you have all that phase 3 data, as if all of this wasn't enough work, it takes it probably takes like 6 months to put together the NDA when you get the last piece.
Can you explain what is NDA for?
A new drug application where you take everything you know, everything from your phase 1s, your phase 2s, your phase 3s, your animal data, your everything, all of your manufacturing information, and you put it together in these modules that are required by FDA and submit it. It'll take them 8 months just to review that, right? So just to kind of give the idea of the complexity and why we have so much growth right now within the organization is to support all of that. And that we want to keep going as a public benefit corporation and nonprofit drug development group. So, with some of the success, we're able to grow and support these initiatives. And
I think
it's
just
still very small compared to what other pharma companies are able to do it for, even with all of the growth, Bia.
Oh yeah, well, we're about 80 people, something like that now, and it's still growing, and that doesn't count the 80 plus therapists that are working on phase 3, all sorts of contractors. So it's amazing. I would say one of my concerns, I guess, about growth is that you have to watch out for the organization not getting too conservative.
That's a kind of nice job to have when you have your boss saying that kind of thing.
Yeah, we look for mission-aligned people.
Yeah, Amy, that made sense to you, sort of?
Yeah. Well, I think it's definitely a part of what we look at as we're expanding, is that we're still looking for mission-driven, mission-aligned people. We are not, people are a lot of times making a sacrifice to come to work with us, and that we don't have the type of money or payroll that a big pharma can come and big pharma person can get in other places. So people that are coming to us are self-selected, I would say, and typically pretty mission aligned, looking for a way to contribute and make a difference in something that they feel meaningful. And I don't see that changing.
I'm going to launch the last question. We're a little bit late on time, but we give people this little extra love. What can people do who are seeking psychedelic therapy now, given that it's still illegal and given that ketamine therapy is so expensive? I know that's a hard question.
What can people do now?
Yeah, given that it's illegal and that ketamine therapy is so expensive.
Well, okay. I mean, the easy, obvious answer is you can do holotropic breath work. You can do other sorts of things. But if you're really interested in psychedelics, one of the reasons why MDMA, I think, is so widespread is it's the easiest to integrate, and it's the easiest for people. It's the most inherently therapeutic of all the psychedelics. Not always. We've heard stories of people who have taken MDMA, stuff comes up, they don't want to deal with it, they push it down, and then months later they're worse off. So I think what people can do is, go to Denver and find mushrooms, or go to Oakland. But I really think it's immoral, the drug war, and I think you need to keep that in mind. Fundamental human rights abuses, and so. But I think really what we really need to legalize and legitimize it, and that's the way that it'll really be accessible and insurance coverage. And so but I think if you're really suffering, I wouldn't wait just because it's not legal yet. But finding the right context is really important.
And for those who aren't suffering so much, but have experienced the benefits of psychedelics, I would recommend volunteering. Your time is always very elevating, and it's a way to give back to our communities. I'd like to mention that the topic of parenting came up here. Rick told some really epic anecdotes in our last Psychedelic Science Summit. And those videos are being put online progressively. I don't know if that panel has been put already or not, but Sunday is Mother's Day. I'm going to participate in a webinar about psychedelics and parents, although I don't have any children, but they still wanted me. So that's going to be Sunday. I want to take this moment to thank Amy and Rick for your tireless efforts. Everybody's curious on whether you get tired. I think you do, but you have a lot of energy. And I also think that I can talk on behalf of myself and my dear colleague Brad and Bryce and all the team, that you are great inspirational colleagues and kind people and friendly. And, we feel very lucky to have you in our leadership. And I want to tell everybody that also we welcome donations. Perhaps I'm going to tell Rick Doubling, how can people donate to MAPS? Because that's one of the things he more like to talk about. So Rick, do you want to give an idea for people that want to donate to MAPS? How can they do it?
Well, we have tried to make it easy for people to donate so that they can give us cryptocurrency, they can give us stocks, they can give us houses, they can give us bonds, they can give us cash, they can go to the MAPS website. So if people are interested in donating, giving at maps.org would be, if you want to talk to somebody personally, or you just go to the website. And we have thousands of donors that support us. We're thinking now that we can soon put some attention to grow the organization a lot. So one way to donate, in a sense, is to talk to other people and have them become members of MAPS and donate. But we try to make it easy for people to donate. The other thing I should say is that if you want to donate to a particular thing, it's possible to give what's called restricted donations. So you could say, like Rebecca Mercer said, my donation is for phase 3, but it's only for veterans. So you could donate for the project in Canada or Israel or eating disorder or anything. You can really go ahead and restrict your donation. But I would just encourage you to realize that we are super high leverage, that for a relatively small amount of money, we're going to be able to really open up the whole field of FDA-approved psychedelic medicine. And then we will recycle income that we make to more research. So
and if you keep on hearing maybe let's stop Rick now, or else you're going to get in debt right away. All right. Thank you, Rick. I want to just say, Amy and Rick, if people want to talk to you, you guys are busy. What's a realistic, can they follow you on social media? Can they write emails?
Well, ask MAPS at maps.org. Send in your questions, and sometimes they get up to Amy. We're not so busy that occasionally we can answer some of those questions.
I'm on Facebook, but pretty much you're going to see pictures of my daughter and my husband if you follow me on Facebook. You're not going to hear me talking about psychedelics there.
Until your daughter gets old enough to start saying, Amy, what about this MDMA stuff?
All right, people.
Normal.
I'm also on Instagram and Twitter at Labate, Bia, B-I-A, and I am at Bia at Maps. events@psychedelic.org. I do answer all my emails about the webinar. You can also write to us at events@maps.org. I want to invite everybody to our next session, which is next week, May 14, Psychedelic Peer Support. I have been thrilled to confess that I turned 49 yesterday and I feel a little bit of an aunt. And I just think it's fascinating how some of you have been following us on the webinars and putting all these Instagram stories live. That's really interesting. And we're trying to think of, how can we leverage this community with new technologies and, maybe create some kind of virtual forum for us to interact. So all suggestions are welcomed. I thank you all for your volunteer work for MAPS, and thanks for being here with us. Sending a big hug and much love in coronavirus crisis. We're together, we're connected, we're part of a community where please don't go outside, please keep safe, please be responsible, and see you here in this virtual space next Thursday at 12 p.m. PTS. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, Bia.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Bia. This is great.